Welcome to episode 257, Autism Through an IFS Lens, Reducing Uncertainty and Building Self-Compassion, featuring Sarah Bergenfield, MA and Certified Level 3 Internal Family Systems Practitioner. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I'm excited for a conversation today that's based in concepts of internal family systems theory and its application for folks who are neurodivergent, specifically with autism and navigating the world. I would like to introduce you to Sarah Bergenfield. She is a certified level 3 IFS practitioner. And so for our listeners who don't know, internal family systems, the acronym is IFS. So moving forward, we'll probably use IFS. And she has been working in this field for quite a few years. And one of her specializations is autism and really understanding how it affects how somebody navigates the world. And then for today, it's kind of looking at autism through an IFS lens. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So for our listeners, why don't you take a moment and tell them about yourself and your background and how this came to be such an important topic for you?
Okay. I am 54. I have 3 children. I was diagnosed 5 years ago on the tail of one of my kids being diagnosed as autistic. It came as a surprise, but also made a lot of sense and helped me understand my life, the challenges that I'd faced, some of my social issues, why I was always blissfully happy alone. And then I sort of pieced that in with my IFS work to help all of my parts who had resistance to embracing that diagnosis, because the condition still carries a lot of stigma and shame. The disability model rather, sort of still has a long reach.
For you, was it helpful, it sounds like, to think about your lived experience through the lens of IFS? Like really making sense of these different parts of yourself and how they were processing and reacting both to the news of an autism diagnosis, but also like navigating the world with that information.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's super helpful to sort of understand that your parts hop in and out of consciousness, basically, as almost like different operating systems.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, it's like very sort of Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche talks about drives and how we have different drives, and parts are very similar to drives.
Why don't we start by talking about what I'll call quick and dirty of IFS. I want to get to,
I've never heard it described
autism
like
piece,
that, but I like it.
But also I'm realizing for our listeners that are not familiar with IFS, we do have some other podcast episodes and courses that I, of course, recommend that you listen to. But for listeners that have no idea what Sarah means when she says my parts, will you give the quick and dirty of IFS
Sure.
and how the model works? And then we'll kind of go from there and exploring its place with autism and understanding a person who has autism.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So IFS was created by Richard Schwartz, Dr. Richard Schwartz, about 30 years ago. And he was working with patients in a clinical setting, in a hospital setting. And I think they were to do with self-harming or eating disorders. And he realized that when he would talk to his patients, that they would say things like, there's a part of me that wants to do this. There's a part of me that really wants to hurt myself. But then there's this other part of me that doesn't want to. And so he established this model, the internal family systems model, and he's a systems thinker, right, which is why he uses that word. And it basically describes multiplicity within each of us and how there are sort of different, almost like personalities, different operating systems is how I like to think of it, that really determine our behaviors, our emotions, how we respond to ourselves, how we respond to others, according to the experiences of that part. And when those parts are very active and they're running the show, we call it blending. And it means that you've blended with a part, and your experience of the world is through the eyes of that part. So you're seeing the world through that lens. And then that part might unblend, and perhaps another part might jump in. And then you'll be having a different experience of the world, right? And a really easy way to describe it is if you're, let's say you're upset with somebody, and there might be a part of you that really wants you to be angry at the person that you're upset at. But then there's another part that comes in that says, no, don't do that. Let's just keep it quiet. Let's suppress how we're feeling, right? So you're constantly negotiating and navigating all of these different perspectives. And these perspectives are formed in childhood, right? And Dr. Schwartz called them parts because it's the easiest way to describe them. And it allows us to feel compassion for them and to establish relationships with them, right? Communicate. We want to understand their experience and their behaviors and their reasons for doing the things that they do. So that's parts. And then the other main teaching of IFS is that when our parts are not active, what is there is our self-energy. So if you're a spiritual person, you might describe that as your soul, your spirit, your ego. Different spiritual lenses have different teachings about that, but it's basically the absence of your parts. So it's that sense of yourself that feels very grounded, very anchored, very true to who you are.
For each person, are there specific identified parts that we all share? Or is it like everybody has their own sets of parts that end up being labeled and understood within IFS?
So probably both and. Each person has their own individual system of parts, right? Within IFS, we label them as managers, firefighters, and exiles. So managers are parts that have very proactive roles. So they're the parts that sort of drive you to do things, the more positive things, the more preventative measures. Firefighters are reactive, so they typically get activated in response to something that somebody else did, a real or a perceived threat. And those are protectors. And then in the layer beneath the protectors are what we call exiles, which are typically younger parts who hold big wounds, big burdens, big beliefs about who they are. And the protector's job is to prevent the young part, the exile, from surfacing and bringing all of that pain and all of those beliefs to the surface, which can sometimes derail us when that happens. So our protectors work really hard to keep our exiles tucked away, and we call them exiled for that, or exiles for that exact reason, that they've sort of been exiled to the outer edges of the system so they don't create too much of a ruckus.
And from the IFS lens, what is the goal, the end goal with consideration of these parts? Is it the flexible moving between them, or is it operating primarily from one particular part?
No, it's the flexible movement, and it's also just the noticing of them. So for me as an IFS practitioner, I believe that the most important thing that IFS teaches us is unblending. And in order to unblend from a part, you have to first notice that the part is there. So if you wake up one day and you're just in a terrible mood and you get to work and someone says, "How are you doing?" and you say, "I'm so angry today." Right, so IFS gives us the language to say there's a part of me that's really angry today, because we're never the entirety of one thing, right? Where there might be a part of us that's really angry, and then probably lurking in the background there's a part that isn't angry. Perhaps there's a part that's sad. Perhaps there's a part that's actually doing okay, right? But this angry one is blocking your access to it. So it's really this idea of acknowledging that we have these different operating systems, and the unblending process allows you to do that. And even just using the language as simple as "there is a part of me that is feeling blank" can be the first step in unblending.
I can hear, as you're talking about it too, these different models that have some similar concepts, different language. So I'm thinking about wise mind and emotion mind in dialectical behavior therapy, or externalizing or internalizing a narrative, and how we're kind of conceptualizing this. And I'm appreciating the language there of, this part of me, because it allows space for the other parts of you too, instead of this like dominant, like it was a bad day. And like, I mean, I guess sometimes you just have really terrible days. And it also was like, but I had a great cup of coffee. Or if we were really going to DBT, that'd be, and I had a great cup of coffee, not a but. But so I appreciate that language. And I'm saying that for our listeners who are used to perhaps different language coming from a different theory, and the flexibility of IFS in talking about these things with clients and explaining them to clients. Thank you. Is there anything more you want to add to the IFS 101, or do you feel like that's an appropriate startup for where we're going?
I feel like that's a good starting point. I guess the other thing I would just like to say is that it's a really beautiful compassion-based relational model, which allows you to really explore who you are and all of the reasons that you have for doing the things that you do, even some of the things that you do that might be self-sabotaging or not in your own best interests. And it just brings you to this incredible place of peace and self-acceptance, which is...
That was going to be my question. So kind of the ultimate goal then is having this flexible movement between parts, ability to understand their roles and how they're impacting how we operate in the world, with the goal of improving, it sounds like, life satisfaction, more values-based living, improved relationships, and then I would guess from that, reduce symptoms of things like anxiety, depression, insomnia, if we tend to lie awake and worry.
Yes, that can sometimes happen. My goal, I don't even worry about getting to that step. I tend to really focus on the understanding piece, because I think that that's something that's really lacking in, especially now, particularly in the culture that we're living in. There's a massive lack of understanding in the world, and it's really hard for us to understand ourselves. There's a lot of, we're sort of living in a judgment-based, very shaming society, and the impacts of those are really, really hard to live with sometimes, right? Those parts that feel lots of shame often will just really demotivate the whole system. And so if you can get to that place of acceptance, then you're accepting that there are parts of you that carry those beliefs, and you can hold them tenderly and be with them.
And then I can see, looking at the culture piece, parts of others.
Absolutely.
That we can have more empathy and patience with, and compassion. Because as you've said, I mean, a time that's charged with so much contempt and judgment and shame. Okay, now we're going to thread this needle, and I'm looking forward to it. Tell me, let's put a pin in IFS. Tell me about autism and its relationship to uncertainty. If we don't know ourselves, if we can't, if we don't feel confident in our ability to navigate changes in the world, tell me that piece, and then let's bring them together.
Okay, so autism is a disorder of predictive thinking. So in order for me to explain the role of uncertainty, I'm going to have to sort of explain predictive thinking and that lens that's used now. And that's my specialty, as I use that lens. That's what I did my master's thesis in. It's the focus of my book that's coming out. And predictive thinking is not a new concept. In fact, it's a concept that has been toyed with through thousands of years. Plato was curious about it. And it's based on this idea of concepts and how we gather all of our information through our senses, right? That's how we make sense of the world, is we gather data through our eyes, our ears, our noses, our sense of touch, and then our interoceptive, our internal systems. But in order to make sense of all of that data, there has to be a concept that's applied to it. Otherwise, it's just meaningless data that's coming in a very sort of exactly, it's chatter. So about 30 years ago, they really started focusing on this, and they used machine learning, and how, when they were programming computers, how they learned that if you program a computer to only focus on the mistakes in the data, the computer is much faster than a computer that focuses on everything. Right? So a computer that focuses on what's called a prediction error works much more efficiently, right? So that's called like a Bayesian inference. And a Bayesian inference is a best guess for the likeliest outcome. the likeliest explanation for an outcome. So researchers in all different areas, right? So this touches biology, zoology, philosophy, consciousness studies, psychology, mathematics, art theory, art history, music theory. They all use this principle of predictive thinking to explain that all of our experience of the world is made up of predictions that use incoming sensory data to validate whether or not the prediction is accurate, right? So what that means is that what you're experiencing in the world is what you expect to experience, because everything is prediction. And there's tons of really amazing research. A couple of books I would recommend. Andy Clark has a book called The Experience Machine. Anil Seth has a book called Being You, in which they talk about this through different lenses. Anil Seth is a consciousness studies professor, and Andy Clark is a philosopher. And they're both fascinating. They're really great writers, and they help explain these concepts of prediction and predictive thinking. So an example I can use is, let's say you're a musician and you're a violinist and you're playing the violin, and you're somewhat experienced, so you know how to play the violin, and you play the wrong note, right? So how do you know it's the wrong note? Because you learned how it should sound, right? So as you're playing and you hit the wrong note is going to register as a prediction error, because your brain created a prediction for how that piece of music should sound, but it doesn't sound the way you expected it to. And so that miscalculation of sound, the wrong note being played, registers as a prediction error. Your brain then takes that signal and sends it to the motor command centers of the brain, which sends a signal out, in this case of our violinist, to the arm and the fingers. You adjust your finger positioning on the string and you play the right note, right? So prediction error corrected. So where we start to see a difference in the autistic brain. So when a prediction error happens and it registers, and your brain's prediction of the meaning of sensory data is a mismatch. So for the violinist, the sound is incorrect. Your brain does one of three things. The first thing is the first option is that it deems that the prediction error is meaningless. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant and nothing needs to happen. The second one is it updates its predictive model, that this particular sensory information can now also mean this, or it kicks it into your consciousness, in which case you take a real world action and you correct the prediction error. The violinist, for example, moving the fingers on the string. So autism disrupts those predictive thinking mechanisms. So research hasn't quite fully concluded exactly how it does, right? But the researchers are all in consensus that autism is an issue of prediction, which means that a brain like mine cannot generally create a best guess for an outcome as a non-autistic brain can. And this is actually very similar for all forms of neurodivergence, that they're all sort of issues of prediction. But I'll talk specifically about autism because that's my area of expertise. So whereas a non-autistic brain can flexibly adjust its model of prediction as you move through the day, a brain like mine cannot. And what that means is that I'm going to pay much more attention to sensory information as it comes in. So it's called overweighting. So my brain is going to overweight the importance of that sensory data, because I cannot easily distinguish between noise versus signal. So the things I need to pay attention to and the things I don't. And I'm going to have trouble updating my predictive model. So if something unexpected happens, it's going to be very jarring. And depending on the thing itself, how big the unexpected outcome was, it's going to determine how I move past that, how I proceed past that. So it could be something as simple as I go into the kitchen to have a cup of coffee and I try and find my coffee mug, and I always use the same coffee mug. In fact, it's sitting right here on my desk now, and I can't find it. A non-autistic person might be able to just reach for another mug and pour a cup of coffee. Someone like me is going to struggle with that. And so I become sort of hyper-focused on, well, I have to have this mug. And I get that as I say that, it starts to sound like OCD, right? And there are some manifestations there that are similar, but I would also say that OCD is also a disorder of prediction. And what it means is that my brain cannot flexibly adjust its expectations of what my coffee mug looks like. I just lack the capacity to do that. I lack the ability to do that. So we're impacted by prediction errors constantly. And the way I sort of try to describe it to people is, for those of you who are listening, in whatever space you're listening, and perhaps you're at your house and you're in your room, maybe you're in your living room, and somebody turns off the lights and they blindfold you. If you had to stand up and find your way to the door with a blindfold on in the dark, you'd probably be able to, right? Because you're familiar enough with your environment that you'd be able to do that. So life with an autistic brain is, imagine that you're at home, you're in the same room, somebody turns off the lights, they blindfold you, they say, okay, now find your way out of the room. But in between you doing that, they move all of the furniture and they move the door. So you actually have no idea where it is, right? So you stand up and you're constantly bumping into things, right? And then you're making a correction and you bump into something else, and then you're correcting and you're bumping into something else. So that's what it's like living with an autistic brain because of these difficulties with the predictive thinking mechanisms.
Thank you. I appreciate how clearly you just outlined that, particularly for those of us who aren't as familiar with these concepts. I think it's really helpful because those examples really illuminate what you're talking about. How does learning come into this? So when we're constantly taking in, as you said, information about our environment that all of our senses are trying to organize, to turn from chatter into something cohesive, to tell us where we are in space, if we're talking too loud or too soft relative to the person that we're talking to, whatever it is. And your example about violin, where we play that wrong note and that predictive error kind of goes, and then we go, oh, this is what I do to get it right. In a perfect world, any of our brains are able to go, oh, this time wasn't right. Now, next time I've learned this thing, I can predict how to avoid that error. Does the same happen in the mind of someone with autism?
No. So the difference is, and this is where the Bayesian inference comes in, right? You learn from past experiences. That's exactly what learning is. All learning is based on prior experiences.
Compiled moments that drive.
Exactly. So I like to describe it as the brain is the original and most efficient data scraping tool ever. Because what the brain does is it scrapes through all of your past experiences, and then it takes all of that information, and then it takes the experiences that you're having right now. So all of the information coming in through your senses in this moment. And it's doing all of this below the level of consciousness, and it's scraping all of your past experiences, and it's finding the closest match to your present experience to determine your perception of the world, right? So in order for that to happen, these learned concepts have to be there as what we call priors, right? So in neuroscience, they call them priors. So an autistic brain has weakened or loose priors, meaning that we cannot necessarily scrape the amount of information that we need in order to create a prediction for what we're experiencing right now. So the outcome of that is rigidity of thinking, inflexible adaptation to environment, changes or unexpected changes can be really hard to navigate, and intolerance of uncertainty. So an autistic person has a need for as much predictability and certainty as possible. So all brains, autistic and non-autistic and all neurodivergent brains, have a need for certainty. That's what the brain is. It's a learning machine. So the brain evolved in order to be metabolically efficient, right? And the best way for it to be metabolically efficient and ensure your survival is with prediction. So a brain like mine that struggles with prediction, right? Not only cognitively, we have challenges of hitting these prediction errors all the time, but we're using a lot more cognitive power than a non-autistic brain. So we typically experience different levels of fatigue. We're spending more time working. Our brains are constantly working and processing.
Being out of spoon
Exactly.
theory is
That's
what's
exactly
coming
where
to mind
spoon
as you
theory
say
comes
that.
in.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
When we can't take in that information and assimilate it and have that learning mechanism kick in where we then don't touch the proverbial hot stove again, whatever that is, how does that affect somebody from a mental health standpoint? Potentially. Everybody is different. Everybody's brains work differently. But when we're looking at someone with autism, we know from the research, for example, that there's a lot of comorbidity of mental health diagnoses. One of the things that you and I were talking prior to recording was about autism and anxiety and like how these concepts come together. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, happily. So using the word anxiety is not my go-to. And here's why. So uncertainty when it's experienced. So when you experience a prediction error in the brain, so that mismatch of prediction versus sensory data, and the prediction error signal gets fired off, it is a signal to the body to prepare for some kind of action to reduce the uncertainty that the prediction error has created. Okay, so that's called arousal. And arousal is your brain's way of preparing you to forage for information. And somebody else who writes really beautifully on all of this is Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a fantastic clinician, and she's a neuroscientist and a really talented writer too, so I highly recommend her work. So when uncertainty is present, you're going to naturally experience high levels of arousal, meaning your nervous system is getting those signals, right? Some cortisol has been released, right? So cortisol is typically thought of as a stress hormone, and it isn't. It's a metabolic modulator. So the purpose of cortisol is to prepare your body to be as efficient as possible in the course of action that it chooses to take. So that's the role of cortisol. But the felt sense of cortisol is what we call arousal. So you're going to get that agitation in the system. So arousal has a purpose, right? And we're going to experience greater levels of arousal when we're experiencing greater levels of uncertainty. And they go hand in hand. So an autistic person, by nature, experiences more prediction errors and has a lower tolerance of uncertainty. And therefore, we experience more arousal. That arousal gets translated into anxiety. So anxiety may or may not be the right word for it, right? So I don't use that word because it's too soon to tell if what the person is feeling is an increased level of arousal because they're experiencing uncertainty, or is it anxiety?
I appreciate you breaking that down. With many quote unquote mental health conditions, there's this element of context that can't really be removed. Like we have that conversation about grief of like, how long is it healthy for somebody to grieve? And it's like, well, there's a lot of context around that concept. And I appreciate what you're saying, which is, well, is this arousal or is this anxiety? And also my next question would be, how would one know the difference? And my guess is that you are probably much better at discerning that. How does one, when working with a client who has autism, or at the very least neurodivergent traits and what I call flavors of autism, is that part of your psychoeducation, working with a client who has autism, to kind of break this down and say, so here's what's happening, and I know that we've called this anxiety. However, for what's happening in your brain,
it might not be.
Right. Contextually, It makes sense.
Right. So I don't determine that, right? But I help the client determine that. And so we look at what the source is, right? So anxiety is typically a fear of something more specific. It's a worry about a particular outcome, right? So anxiety, the way I sort of visualize it is that it is attached to a particular thing, right? Whereas arousal often has nothing to which it's attached. It has no source that you can tap into initially.
I'm glad you bring up that point, because I think that's a pretty common lived experience for many folk, is this sense of arousal without an obvious precipitant. I don't know why I feel so keyed up. I just feel really uneasy. Can you speak to that kind of through your knowledge of people with autism, where it's like, okay, so again, I'm guessing, I'm going to take a shot in the dark here, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm guessing that it's like, just because we don't know what that external thing is doesn't mean that there isn't something that was being taken in from the environment to contribute to the arousal that happened within your body and brain.
Exactly. And arousal in an autistic body can be caused by the fact that your socks are too tight and there's too much sensory information coming in, and your brain is very focused, right? It's overweighting the importance of that sensory information, and it can't really make sense of it and file it away appropriately. So that's going to cause arousal.
Right. So that chatter.
There's
that chatter
exactly.
That's keeping the nervous system a little bit keyed up because there's too much coming in.
Exactly. It could be caused by, I typically have it it starts on the evenings before, so the evening before the days that I see clients, right? And in case any of my clients are listening, I love you all and I'm very happy to be working with you, but I am still an autistic person, and connecting with other humans has a level of uncertainty to it that increases the arousal in my body, right? So I'll wake up, it starts the night before, I'll wake up the morning of, and I will be sort of racked with arousal. And I'm not using the word anxiety deliberately. It might feel very similar, right? So interoceptively, the signals that my body is experiencing feel very much like anxiety, but I'm consciously choosing to not use that word because I don't want to label it as anxiety, because that's not helpful. But if I label it as arousal to do with the uncertainty that I'm facing based on what my day looks like, that makes sense to me. And so the way that I handle that uncertainty, my autistic way of handling that uncertainty, is the first thing I do is I open my calendar and I look at who's on my schedule for that day. And then I'm a very visual thinker, so I will picture the person's face. I know what time I have them scheduled. I look at my breaks for the day and I think about, okay, at this time I'm going to have a cup of coffee. At this time I might make some tea. At this time I can have a snack. And I'm constantly scripting my day. And when I say scripting, I don't mean scripting, writing out a script for what I'm going to say verbally. I mean scripting as in knowing. My son calls it collecting data. He's a statistician, so that's sort of in keeping with his brain. But I'm collecting data about what my day is going to look like, because the more data I have, the less uncertainty I have. And the less uncertainty I have, the less arousal I feel.
By the way, I want to jump back to one of the first things you said there. I feel like you just described what I would call like the clinical Sunday scaries. Because I think there are many clinicians that have that same feeling where it's like, oh, this.
Right.
Because you are on, and speaking as a neurodivergent clinician myself, there's a lot of intensity and potential arousal around being on.
Yes.
It's a lot of onness.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, I can
and you don't know
totally
what that
connect with
onness is going to look like.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I think that's one of the most interesting things about being a therapist, is like walking into a room and it's like, oh, your last session, like we were talking about how you were excited that they had that kind of Dr. Pepper available, and then you walk in and you're like, and then what happened? And like completely, like, you just never know what's going to come up. Anyway.
And for someone like me, you never know how much sort of cognitive power you're going to have available to you each day. Right. So my capacity, exactly how many spoons I have, my capacity is going to be determined by what clothes I'm wearing. Did I sleep the night before? Am I hungry? And if so, have I eaten? Who's on my schedule? What might be happening in my own personal life? Do I have a book deadline? Like there's a whole sort of, coagulation of factors that impact how many spoons I have available to me to show up for my clients.
For our listeners who aren't familiar with spoon theory, I'm going to give you a very quick overview. The supposed origin story, who knows if this is true, but the supposed origin story of spoon theory was that a person was trying to explain to another person, to a loved one, what it felt like to have a chronic illness, and was at a cafe, grabbed some spoons and said, let's say I start out the day with 10 spoons and going to get coffee with you costs 2 spoons. And if I need to go to a doctor's appointment, that's another 3 spoons. And I run out of spoons. Basically, I run out of energy because of these other things going on in my body. And I'm born into a world where other people may have more spoons than I do, or because of circumstance, I don't have enough spoons right now. Maybe I didn't sleep well. Maybe I am recovering from a cold, or I'm getting a cold. Who knows? But so spoon theory is this idea that what existence is asking of me is more than I have to give. So basically, when I'm out of spoons means I can't make any more commitments. I'm going to struggle more with decision making. I don't have enough energy. And that is a phenomenon that has now gone from chronic illness, but also now talked about more with folks who are neurodivergent, of struggling, like folks who have ADHD. It's like I've been working so hard to figure out getting my taxes put together. I have no spoons left today to decide what I'm going to have for lunch. And for people with an autism diagnosis, or what I call smoldering or flavors of autism, just feeling kind of out of energy and maybe paralyzed because you just don't have any spoons left. So for folks, if you want to look up spoon theory, that's what Sarah and I are talking about. But so it's an interesting and helpful analogy, because now I think so many people use that language, and because of social media, like being out of spoons is used a lot more. So now if you didn't know before, what it means when we talk about spoon theory.
So I actually I don't use that language too much in my work, just because I tend to use demand versus capacity. And I use that because that's in the DSM, that's part of the clinical, that's one of the clinical notes for diagnosing an autistic, is that autistic traits and characteristics become much more visible as demand starts to exceed capacity. So it's the same fundamental idea, is that you have a finite capacity and the demands of the world basically reduce your capacity as you go through your day. And once those demands exceed your available capacity, all of the autistic traits listed in the DSM, so, your repeated and repetitive behaviors, inability to make eye contact, difficulties with social skills, communication, all of those things are going to become much more evident. And using the predictive thinking piece, demand exceeding capacity is as uncertainty increases and certainty decreases, your autistic traits become much more visible, because those traits are your brain's way of seeking predictability. So stims, repeated and repetitive movements, right? They provide tactile feedback or auditory feedback to the brain in a very repetitive pattern, predictable, exactly. So it's your brain's natural way of seeking out predictability. So one of the things I love to teach my autistic clients is how wise they are, that there is in this incredible abundance of wisdom in, I would say, any neurodivergent brain. But again, I feel much more confident talking about autism. But in an autistic brain, there's an abundance of wisdom that the brain knows what it needs. The autistic body knows what it needs, and that's it. It's providing it for you. And then along comes society, right, with their disability models and different ideas of how we should be in the world, and they shut down those behaviors or those strategies that we have in order to soothe our systems. And that's really when we start to see issues. And I think most autistic people would say, if the world were designed by a neurodivergent brain, we'd all be way happier, right? That the issues we have are because we're trying to fit into a world that isn't designed for us, that has too much uncertainty and too much noise and light and people and all of the things that we struggle with.
Well, and a specific set, depending on the culture, a set of ways that it is socially sanctioned to handle those things. So when the demand is high and it exceeds our abilities in that moment, then to flap or whatever society is saying, no, don't do that. But it's like the nervous system's going, no, but I need to.
Right. I have to.
This is how I'm going to regulate, and I know what I need to do. Okay. So I'm so excited for where we're going right now. Bring it together for me in talking about predictive thinking and IFS. I'm so excited for where you're about to go right now. I'm like, get my popcorn. Let's do this.
It sounds like a lot of pressure for me. Okay. So the work that I do and the focus of my particular IFS work is I take the neuroscience of predictive thinking and I bring it into the IFS model. So what that means is that our parts, right, these little operating systems, these sort of little sub-personalities that were created in childhood, each carry their own predictive thinking models for how things are going to be, right? So let's say you grew up in a household that really valued performance and you studied hard in school, you did really well in school and you got A's all the time and great report cards, and you would take your report card home and your parents would be thrilled and they would validate and tell you how great you are and make you feel good. Perhaps they bought you a present, right? Whatever the outcome of that was. So what that is your parents are reinforcing the idea that performance is important and that performance is important to who you are as a person in the world. So that part of you now has a predictive model that performance equals being loved, performance equals success, performance equals validation, right? So each part has their own predictive model, and that within that predictive model, there are going to be behaviors, there are going to be expectations of outcomes, and there are going to be fears, and there are going to be emotions, and they're all within that predictive model. So what IFS does is it connects you from the present moment, so the 2025 version of yourself, it connects you to that child version of yourself, and through that connection, that relational piece of going back and forth and learning more and more about that part, you gradually allow that part to start to update its predictive model. And so it can now start to believe that a new outcome is possible. So as a child, it may have been performance driven. In 2025, your world is different. You have different people in your life. You have different skills, different things available to you, and you don't need to be so performance driven, but that part doesn't know it, right? So that predictive model has stayed intact despite not being helpful. So by bringing it to the present, you allow that predictive model to update, and that part can now start to think, oh, perhaps I don't have to be so performance driven, because there can now be different emotions applied to this predictive model.
For kicks and illustration purposes, can you please give us a case example of this? Like, I want to imagine you as an IFS practitioner working with a client who has autism. Can you give us a circumstance where you're like, okay, let's do this, and bring in kind of this framing? I'm trying to think of what we could invent for a client of a problem that they might bring in, or a behavior, and then how you are clinically taking in that information, and then what you do with that from an intervention standpoint.
Sure. I will use myself as an example, because that way I don't have to worry about confidentiality issues if I'm talking about my own system. So I grew up in a very chaotic household with an undiagnosed autistic mother who was a single parent, and she had 4 of us, and then my brother was born when I was 16. As a young child, my household was chaotic, and I had some abandonment issues as a child that basically came from the fact that my mother would leave at different times in our life. So during my IFS work, I connected with a 5-year-old part of me who was holding these abandonment fears. And the fear was that if she were abandoned, what was going to happen to her, that there was nobody to take care of her, right? So that was her predictive model based on her experience. That's what I experienced at that time. So fast forward to, I forget when it was, what year, 2021, I think it was, that I connected with her. And I realized that I was using her behavior and her emotions in my relationship with my husband. So my husband would do something, we'd get into an argument. One of his protective strategies was withdrawal. His withdrawal was triggering my abandoned 5-year-old, right? So what I did was, here's the lovely relational piece, is I got to know her and I got to be with her, and I kept showing her that she wasn't going to be abandoned, right? And as time went on, she was able to see that she didn't need to fear abandonment, right? So she was actually able to fully update her predictive model so that in any situation where there was a perceived threat of abandonment, she knew that it wasn't going to happen, right? So the fear may be there initially. I may get the emotional response of her, the sort of the agitation and the panic. And then connecting to her just reinforced this updating of the model, so she could now be in the present with me and think, okay, actually, I get that what I'm seeing here are, I'm getting a lot of sensory feedback that this situation was sort of reminiscent of when I was a child. And the way I'm feeling now is reminiscent of how I felt as a child. But actually, if we look at the larger context, I can see that that's not the case. So the context piece is particularly important for autistics, because within the world, we actually struggle with contextual thinking. And as we're having these prediction errors, and we're sort of like trying to figure out our way around our modeling systems, we don't actually bring context into it. So you could go to a restaurant. If you're an autistic person, let's say you want to go to a restaurant, you want to see some friends. The restaurant's super noisy, like there's 27 televisions all over the walls, and sound and music and people, and that's going to create agitation in the system. If you're like me, it's going to create a lot of agitation, a lot of arousal, way too much uncertainty, too much sensory data being processed, heightened levels of arousal in my body. Okay. The context of the restaurant is rendered irrelevant. It doesn't feel safe. It's translated as a signal of danger, despite the fact that the context that I'm in is actually safe. So the autistic brain struggles. We call it seeing the forest for the trees, right? We're focused on the trees. My whole life is made up of trees, and I really struggle to see the forest. And that's wider contextual thinking. So IFS, when you're doing parts work, actually teaches you how to bring in context. And if you have a skilled clinician, especially one who's educated in autism, they can help you with that. And they can help you understand and piece together the context for why this part of you had those feelings back then, but within the context of today, it doesn't need to.
And when that happens, when the forest is taken into consideration, what are the benefits to a person with autism? I mean, I'm going to take a stab at it again. Tell me if I'm way off here. By understanding what's happening and why, it could reduce our meta feeling, the labeling of the feeling and interpreting it as something potentially shameful or undesired or bad. Then just reducing that shame reduces arousal and could allow us to hold on to more of those proverbial spoons, because we haven't used as many kind of judging our experience of the world. We're able to have more spoons just to navigate the world, let alone judging our experience of it.
Right. So that's definitely a huge piece of it. And that's a really important piece of it, right? Is that you lose the judgment of your own behaviors and your own responses to things. So when different parts get active, right, think of each part as using a separate spoon, right? And before you know it, the dishwasher's full of spoons and there's nothing left in the drawer, right? And you're just out completely. So the fewer parts you have active, the fewer spoons they're going to use. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it is that the more you know about yourself, the more certainty you're creating, right? And the more you're reducing uncertainty. because you understand why something is happening. So IFS, the IFS process follows what we call an epistemic arc. So the epistemic arc is the learning arc, right? That's how the brain learns. And it starts with curiosity. And in IFS, curiosity is one of the C words, the 8 C's of self. So we have curiosity present, and curiosity is an indicator that there is a belief that things can be different. That even if you don't understand right now, you have enough belief that at some point you will, right? So that's what curiosity is. So curiosity allows you to learn. You cannot learn without curiosity, because if you don't believe that you're going to understand that why something is the way it is, the learning process shuts down, right? So curiosity has to be there for learning. So you start there, you travel this beautiful arc of learning where you're identifying the part, you're noticing it, you're naming it, you're befriending it, you're listening to its experience, you're witnessing, perhaps you're relieving it of any burdens that it's carrying. And at the end of that, you hit what we call an aha moment, right? And an aha moment is that moment of understanding. That's the learning arc. So you travel from not knowing through the learning to the moment of knowing, also called an aha moment. And in IFS, we use the beautiful question. It's my favorite question to ask. Does that make sense to you? Does it make sense to you why this part of you felt that way? Right? And hopefully at that point, the answer you get is yes. At that moment of understanding, that aha moment, you get a little dopamine discharge, right? So dopamine discharges improve confidence, improve feelings of well-being, and that confidence is cumulative. So the more you connect with your parts, the more you build confidence in your system, the more you take that out into the world. For an autistic person who's navigating a world that really doesn't make sense most of the time, having that confidence, even if it's just within your own system, is massive. And that's why I love using the IFS model with a brain like mine.
For you and your lived experience, sorting through what probably was many aha moments, where it's like, oh, autism diagnosis, like, what does this mean? And oh, that moment makes a lot more sense in retrospect. You kind of self-applied IFS. Are more practitioners using IFS specifically with people who have autism?
Yes. And I did self-apply it, but I also had a highly skilled IFS therapist that I was working with. We didn't bring in the autism piece initially because I started working with her pre-diagnosis, but she really taught me like the concepts of the model. And to me, it just made total sense. I could just go in immediately and find a part, and they just sort of pop up and it's like, oh, hello. And, I'm very relational with my own system, which is interesting and I'm relational, like as you and I are talking, I'm very relational and I'm very connected to my clients. But in the world, typically, I struggle with the relational piece. So I can connect to people very deeply, and I have friends with whom I feel very connected. But I would say the majority of the world, I am not in relationship with most of the world because I just don't know how to do that outside of sort of the common areas that connect me to my friends.
And through IFS, a better relationship with self.
Yes, right. And for somebody like me, and for a lot of autistics, we really like being by ourselves.
It's predictable. It's potentially
exactly
more predictable.
Well, that's it. Especially once you add in the IFS piece, it becomes much more predictable. Because now if I'm sensing, some kind of emotion, or I'm feeling down, or I'm feeling angry, or I feel like I can't do something, I now have the tools to sit and connect to that part, right? Which then helps to restore predictability to the system, because I have that moment of, okay, I know what's happening here.
Using you as our case example. Thank you.
You're welcome. I disclose all of my secrets.
So let's say you have this moment where the firefighter part of you is just leading the show, which regardless of autism is true for all of us. Right. But particularly for a person whose brain functions in a neurodivergent way. So they're super activated, nervous system is going, like, we got to shut down that fire, we got to protect ourselves. When that moment happens for you, what happens with the IFS part? Like what kicks in the learning and the predictability and now the knowledge of self where you're like, okay, firefighters coming into action. Then tell me the next thoughts.
Well, the next step is I notice that the firefighter's coming into action. And that's the gift right there. I mean, if there's one thing you learn from studying IFS, it's that you start to notice the things that you're doing, right? So you're very grounded in the present moment, and you're able to witness your own experience, which is the goal of all mindfulness programs in the world. So I believe that IFS is absolutely a mindfulness system, for sure.
Thank you. That's what I was thinking as you were saying it. I'm glad you named it. And then in doing so, you're not spinning your cognitive, emotional, physiological wheels as much because you can understand what's happening. And a word that you had used at the very beginning of this conversation, but I'm seeing it all come full circle now, is being much more embodied with the experience of what's happening instead of like this kind of separate self. It's like, no, this is within me and these parts are acting this way for good reason. And now I can be present with what they're going through right now.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's all about, understanding and having compassion for yourself. The one thing I do want to bring in here is that not everything is parts. And I'm really clear about this. And I've been clear about this in the IFS world. I presented on this topic a few years ago at the conference, that autism is not caused by parts. Autism is autism. And the parts in an autistic system are also autistic. Self-energy is also autistic. And so my autistic self-energy is still going to have autistic needs, right? So I'm going to need that reduction in uncertainty in order for me to be able to connect to my self-energy and really feel it, right? I have that need. I will always have that need. So when I'm working with clients, we're constantly exploring. We're sort of unbraiding the rope of, well, here's the rope, here's the cause, here's the effect. But let's unbraid it and see how much of that is coming from a neurological need that you have, right? And how much of that is coming from an emotional need that you have, or a parts-driven need or behavior.
I really appreciate you making that distinction, and I think it's a helpful one. So thank you. I'm glad before you ended that you made that comment, because I think it also draws a lot of attention to the danger of oversimplifying. And saying, well, if we just do this, then that thing will resolve. And you're saying, no, it's still an autistic mind. So thank you. I appreciate that. I have so many more questions. For listeners who also have lots of questions and they're listening to you talk, what are some of your favorite resources to learn about what you're discussing today?
Mm-hmm. Well, any of the books that I named today are really great. I have a conference talk on the IFS YouTube channel from 2022, I think it was. That's a free resource for people. What else is there? In terms of IFS and autism, there's some stuff out there now. It's sort of just beginning to become something that's more talked about. So you can take a look and see what else is out there. The book I have is coming out hopefully later this year. That's, fingers crossed, going to be a great resource for people. I have to say I'm totally out of the social media loop on this stuff. You would think I don't have an iPhone, because I just am not in that world. I'm in the research world. I'm the dork sitting at home reading research papers all the time. Like, that's my go-to. I carry them around on my iPad. you're not going to find me on TikTok or anything like that, but you'll find me looking at an academic research paper studying what happens when we dream and how our predictive thinking mechanisms change when we're dreaming, right? And why is it that, all right, I'm going to get into a little too much detail here, but why is it that, because I'm fascinated by this, when we're dreaming, you can be in the middle of a dream and you can suddenly realize that you need to pee, right? And you need to go to the bathroom, and all of a sudden the entire focus of the dream is or maybe this is just me, is of going into a bathroom, but the toilet doesn't work. And you can't actually pee because the toilet's broken. There's no door. It's flooded. You can't get the lid up right. And I'm fascinated by the predictive thinking piece of that my body's registering the stimuli, the sensory information, but my brain, because I'm asleep, can't quite piece it together to come up with, wake up, get out of bed and go and use the bathroom.
Yeah, I've had my own version of that same experience where like you're taking in either internal or external data while you're sleeping, and then it appears in your dream, and it's like your brain's trying to figure out
But it's
like what just happened.
nonsensical in the dream.
Yeah.
It's like the toilet's in the middle of the train station. It's like, well, I can't because it's like,
What do I do now?
right.
We can keep talking about this. Sarah, for our listeners who specifically want to learn more about you, what's the best way to do that?
You can go to my website, sarahbergenfield.com. You'll see me and my dog, Magnus, who's, yes, the love of my life. He's on there. I'm kind of boring, but if you want to reach out, please do. You're welcome to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions or send resources. Or if you also have a love of research, lots and lots of resources to send your way if you're interested.
Fantastic. Again, for our listeners, we've had the joy today of hearing from Sarah Bergenfield about autism and uncertainty, and then the application of IFS to help our clients with autism. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. It's been lovely.
It was fun.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.